Hello, this is the Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. I'm Ian.
And I'm Mike.
And a couple of weeks ago, Mike and I both started rereading Master and Commander, the first novel in a book series that meant a lot to both of us. That's the Jack Aubrey, Stephen Maturin novels by Patrick O'Brien. So to get us straight into talking about the books, Mike, could you maybe just give us a super abridged description of Master and Commander, the first book in the series, as you pick it up for the first time? What kind of a book is it?
So I think most people would know this book, if they knew it at all, as a historical fiction Navy. Might be expecting a little sea action. What they might not know is there's some great character studies, impeccable attunement to those times and people and characters on shore as well as on sea.
Onshore and offshore as well. Cool. Okay, thank you. And then how about for readers? Why is a guy like you or a guy like me picking up this book and going into rereading these books again? What are we getting from it?
You know, for me, it's just this, I'm locked in at home and I'm returning to series that I love. And having just finished Harry Potter, this was my immediate second. And I have to say that it's been a number of years since I went through it. And I thought, wow, I forgot how rich, how wonderful this is.
Fantastic. So speaking of rich and wonderful, I know that you were looking through kind of literary reviews and kind of quotes. You came up with some really great quotes of what other people have said about these books. Tell us a couple of the examples that you had there.
Yeah, well, I mentioned historical fiction, so let's go to Mary Renault, who's a great historical novelist herself. You know, she said, and I quote, "Mr. O'Brien does not just have the chief qualifications of a first-class historical novelist, he has them all." Then we'll go to somebody a little more recent, Joe Hill, author in his own right, son of Stephen King, one of my favorite novelists, who said, "Every Aubrey Maturin book is packed to absolute straining with erudition, wit, history, and thunderous action."
Like the sound of that. Any others?
Well, let's see. Let me go across the pond. I'm kind of, well, actually, I guess that was English. That was American. Let's go to Ireland because Ireland features prominently in these things. Kevin Myers, writing in the Irish Times, said, "You're in for the treat of your lives. Thank God for Patrick O'Brien. His genius illuminates the literature of the English language and lightens the lives of those who read him."
Wow. So that's what we're letting ourselves in for. Great to be starting to reread these again. You know, with all of that, plus the fact that we both have a little bit of time on our hands, as you mentioned, there are 19, 20 more books that come after Master and Commander. So we were thinking that we might do something to share through this podcast to highlight and intensify that rereading experience that Mike and I are going through and share it with all of you as well. So Mike, remind me, what was on our list of things that we're trying to achieve with this podcast?
Well, one of the things we said we wanted to do was to share our enjoyment as we read through this series. You know, we're starting with Master and Commander, and who knows, maybe we'll make it all the way through to Blue at the Mizzen, book number 20 in the series.
Oh, that would be cool. Okay. And that means that we'll be able to dig into what makes the stories enjoyable and maybe build a little bit on our own personal take on the books and maybe exploring what other people and other readers have liked about them too.
Yeah, I like that. And, you know, we can kind of relish those best bits, maybe scratch our heads together over the parts that maybe we like a little bit less.
Yeah, I guess we're going to find some of those too. And I'm really looking forward to kind of finding new things out as well, you know, looking for moments that are new or at least new to us that we can discover as we're kind of going back, rereading these favorite books of ours, shed some new light on the characters and the situations as we go along.
Absolutely. And if you're listening to this podcast, we hope you'll enjoy the reading, the digging, the head scratching, the relishing, and that discovery along with us.
So in each podcast, I guess we'll take a chunk of a book and kind of talk about the story as it unfolds, go into some of our favorite bits, see where the conversation takes us, right?
Maybe before we dive in, a little backstory, just a teaser, you know, something previously in the Aubrey Maturin series. You know, when and where in the world did Patrick O'Brien start writing Master and Commander? And when and where in the world did readers first encounter the book? Ian, any insights?
Oh, great question, and God bless the internet, right? So here we go. According to Wikipedia, Patrick O'Brien was an English novelist with Irish ancestors on his mother's side, so hence there's a strong Irish connection there. By 1969, he was already 55 years old and already 4 decades into a literary career that wasn't making him much in the way of money or fame. Hey, Mike, imagine that, being in your 50s and nobody's ever heard of you, huh? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
So, and he, O'Brien, was living in relative obscurity in the south of France with his wife, and as well as some literary fiction and biography and translations, he had, I think, in the past already written a couple of kind of light-hearted novels that were set in 18th century naval voyages of exploration. And if you think back, well, I can just about think back into the 60s, not with any reading in mind. Maybe you can, Mike. Popular fiction was doing great business in the 60s. This was the era of what? Catch-22, the John le Carré books, Ludlum, Frank Herbert's Dune. Paperback reading had really taken off. And in 1966, C.S. Forester died. Now, I've read all the Hornblower books of C.S. Forester, and we might talk about them again in a second. But C.S. Forester dies. That means the world doesn't get any more of these famous kind of swashbuckling naval hornblower novels, and I believe an American publisher suggested to O'Brien that he could try something in this genre of naval historical fiction.
Yeah, clearly. So we're in 69. There's already a readership developed for exactly those kinds of stories, and they couldn't get any more of their desire for Hornblower. So presumably, that kind of readership, then probably mostly historical nerd types. And that would have been a bit of a narrow audience, even with the size of the American reader base.
Right. I mean, we could both call ourselves history nerds, but there's probably not enough of us in the world to make a fortune for a publisher. But to be fair, I mean, I read all the Hornblower books. I loved them. I still enjoy them, but they're not exactly kind of prize-winning literary fiction. They're great, pick it up and read it fiction. So it might well be that American publisher was just hoping for, a bankable series of pot boilers for people to pick up on their holidays, and that the paperbacks would sell over a few seasons, and that would be nice business.
Yeah, so it's going to be really interesting to see what it was about O'Brien's writing and about the readership's response to it that took him to such great commercial success and such heights of critical acclaim on both sides of the Atlantic, and that caused two guys like us to start a podcast over them 50 years later.
Right. Well, that's the big question, and maybe that's our whole theme, right, for the whole series of podcasts. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's all to come in the future. I think we've talked about it long enough. I think we better start turning the pages of Master and Commander and see what all the fuss is about. So here we go. Chapter 1. I'm looking at the Wikipedia plot summary for Master and Commander, and it says the novel opens in April 1800. Jack Aubrey, a shipless lieutenant, or if you speak American, lieutenant, wasting away in the Royal Navy port of Mahon in Minorca, meets Stephen Maturin, a destitute Irish Catalan physician, natural philosopher, at a concert at the governor's mansion. And music is going to be a theme in their relationship, we see already. And during the performance, says Wikipedia, Maturin elbows Aubrey, because Aubrey's beating the measure half a beat ahead. He's kind of conducting the piece to himself half a beat ahead. And the men, who are both at personal low points, treat it as a matter of honor. They exchange names and they anticipate a duel. This kind of goes from trivial and social to kind of deep personal animus just in a couple of sentences, right?
Right.
So it struck me that they don't get introduced to each other. If you look at the way people in the early 19th century were introducing themselves to each other in all of the rest of these books and in Jane Austen, an introduction of one person to another tends to take the form of, allow me to name my particular friend. But they meet each other without any social context, and they have to kind of give each other's names and say where they are to be found. I've got to say, at first, I didn't read that as being kind of the setup for a duel. But looking at it again and thinking about it, it does seem like they were basically saying, if you didn't like me digging you in the ribs and you want to come find out some more about it, here's where you can find me. Was that how you saw it as well, Mike?
Yeah, it clearly there was a little bit of that potential for calling out, but it seemed more like they were both at kind of low points and a little more than usually irritable, and this kind of sparked it.
Yeah, fair. Although I think for Stephen, as we get to know him in the rest of the books, I think he's at his only slightly above his normal level of irritability. But like you say, they're all on a bit of a low point. And it's
That's
funny, isn't
right.
it? They're not they're not high status individuals either.
No.
A lieutenant in the Navy on shore without a job is kind of scraping by, and it turns out that Stephen Maturin's kind of squatting in a ruined shack somewhere up in Port Mahon. So neither of them is on top of the world. And it's funny. I was kind of asking myself, why are we in Mahon in Majorca? Sorry, Menorca, and not Portsmouth, and not blockading Toulon or Brest, which is where the action might have started if you were in a Hornblower type story. And maybe we're meeting these two kind of remote, far away from the hierarchy of British life. They're surrounded by the British naval hierarchy because Mahon is a naval base, at least for the time being, for Britain, and all of the expatriate British institutions are there. And we know, I think, that Patrick O'Brian really loved the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, the Catalan coast of France, really close to Barcelona, was where he was living at the time, and he lived most of his active adult life. So maybe that was a little bit of Patrick O'Brian saying, "This is my home," and we might get to talk later on about how we see the two characters changes depending on where they are. But I think it was a cute and sort of interesting choice to place them not in a traditional kind of naval HQ or naval action setting, but kind of out in this fairly remote outpost.
Yeah, and not to jump ahead, but one that they wouldn't be able to be in, or would have to be in a much different context very shortly in future books.
Yeah. Because let me see. For history buffs, the Peace of Amiens is coming in about 20 months time. So
Mhm.
they're gonna have to get some action in. And interestingly, like you said in the intro, Mike, we're getting this sense here that this is not a sort of action swashbuckling boredom in the smoke kind of a story. Already, we're getting the idea that some of the action is going to be on shore, right?
Yeah, which is one of the things that I was a little bit, in some ways, surprised to go back to, and then fondly remembered and said, "God, this is one of the reasons I relish this." It's not, today's big theater productions of one action scene, very loosely tied to another. It's really a story, great depth, great richness.
Yeah, fantastic. And he packs so much into these first couple of chapters as well. I mean, we're not going to
Oh,
cover it all, but he's introducing the characters to each other, and we're learning a little bit about them as personalities. Some of the backstory is filled in by conversations with other people, and then I think we get one of these classic moments, classic Patrick O'Brien moments, where Aubrey reads himself in on the quarterdeck of the Sophie, the small ship, the brig that he's now appointed to be commander of. Um, we get this phrase, "Hereof nor you nor any of you may fail, as you will answer to the contrary at your peril." And I think a few more people in the world could do with orders like that, couldn't they, Mike?
yeah. And I love, this is one of the things that I think years after I had read this that still rung through my mind as I thought back on it. This whole idea of, you know, uh, at your peril, suffering death. I mean, I'm jumping ahead here.
Yeah,
This Levitical air to some of this, and how reassuring people found it to say, "Gosh, that's what I know. That's what's routine. That's what I feel
right.
comfortable in, albeit a threat to our very persons."
Yeah, that's right. And we hear later on that people read the articles of war aboard ship in place of having Sunday worship. So
Right.
the words have the same kind of role. The words of order and hierarchy from the Admiralty have the same place in people's lives as as divine worship. So yeah, striking. The other thing I
Yeah.
just want to mention before we move on from the introduction is I love the setup from the introduction and looking at how these two characters meet. It's like it's like a rom com, except it's bromance rather than romance, right? It would be such a classic Nora Ephron rom com thing for the two characters to meet, feeling a bit grouchy. They really fall out. They hate the sight of each other. They part on really bad terms, but then they meet the next day in a different context, and something has changed in the air. And all of a sudden, they sit down over a meal, and then actually the friendship blossoms. And we're getting, rom com bromance, but in the 19th century and between two guys. It's amazing.
It really is, and I've scratched my head, and you have much better memory and recall and things. But I was trying to think to myself, where in fiction do we have this kind of relationship between two men that continues over 20 books, highs and lows, in this incredible bromance, philosophical, all of life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We get lots of, especially kind of male-oriented books. We have a protagonist and a sidekick.
Right.
Holmes and Watson. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, Batman and Robin. But those are always kind of, there's the main dude and there's the kind of the hanger-on. And really interesting how this story is being told with both of them as kind of co-protagonists. We'll talk some more about which point of view Patrick O'Brian feels the most affinity with between Jack and Stephen, I guess. But you know, the idea of Batman and Robin is kind of, that's not where we are. This is two people who are going to kind of find their way to be friends or whatever they're going to be.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely
Fantastic.
true.
So they've got to learn about each other. We, the readers, get to learn about them, and we already start to get into the kind of naval mechanics. But once we get into chapter 2, there's this really great and a reasonably kind of subtle opening up of all of the naval technicalities. So how about that, Mike? I think you had some thoughts on that.
Well, it really fascinates me that sometimes I'll be looking at ratings on Goodreads or on Amazon or on other people who've written about Master and Commander or about the series in itself. And one of the things that comes up very rarely, but it does come up, people say, "Oh my gosh, couldn't get into it because it's got all these technicalities." And I
Right.
remember when I first opened Master and Commander, there was an illustration of all these sails with all the names that to me looked a little bit more complex than the biology section of multiple sheets that you would flip through in your high school reader. And I thought, oh my gosh, I will never understand what all these are. Luckily, I have a sailing buddy in you who could wisen me up a little
Right.
bit. But I quickly found that it really didn't matter. It didn't take me away from
Right.
the story. And in fact, he uses this phenomenal device to say Stephen knows nothing about the Navy, nothing about ships or boats or, all the particular terms to call them. And it's fascinating because he's such a brilliant person. He has so many depths, ranges of interest in natural philosophy and, you know, a physician in all the things that he does, but knows nothing about this. And O'Brien uses this way of being able to introduce us to so many things by having Stephen taught by midshipmen, by other
Yeah.
people, and telling him about, here's all the sails, here's the mast, here's the rigging. And it's just a fabulous way to say, if you want to know more about this, it's right there. And it's done in an entertaining and engaging way. If you don't want to, just being a listener of the books as I am, as well as a reader of the books, just let those words roll over your ears. So his research clearly was impeccable, amazing, the way he brings this to bear. But he also, again, does it in a way that says, if you miss all of that, you don't lose any of the story.
Right.
And it
Yeah.
does not have to get in your way. So I would say, particularly to new readers in the series, hang in there. If you're loving it, if you know nautical things, by all means. If you don't, just have a fantastic time, particularly as these naval salts explain to Stephen as they would to any landsman by saying things like, it has two masks, and holding up their fingers to show the number two and speaking
Yeah.
very slowly. So if you're a lubber like me, you'll get to relish that as well.
Very good. Oh, and of course, man, the lubber's hole, the means by which
Yeah,
a neophyte, a newbie, is unable to climb up to the top. That was such a great piece of language that we chose it for the name of the podcast, right? The lubber's hole is
absolutely.
where you go when you're just learning. Um, that's great. And like you say, it's O'Brien pays us this great compliment of saying, "I'll smatter the technicalities in there, and I'll enjoy all the kind of the deliciousness of the language, but you don't need it, and you can catch up."
Absolutely. It's funny being O'Brien. You get that lovers' hole reference, twice, one right after another. One with Stephen, one with Jack. Jack first, then with Stephen, and
Right.
and to great
Right.
comic relief as well as educational value.
Yeah. And I think we get the idea that the connection between Stephen and the ship's company and him learning the kind of nautical language is always going to be a light note, and it's going to be kind of comedy. There's also kind of a dark note coming, I think, as we get to know the first lieutenant, this kind of second in command of the ship, James Dillon. And we can probably cover quite a bit of James Dillon's arc right now, because it's used really fascinatingly to add this there's this dark tone of something bad could happen on this ship, because we learn that James and Stephen actually knew each other, both as men involved in the United Irishmen, the kind of Irish rebellion at the end of the 18th century, and they pretend at first not to recognize each other, and then they kind of halfly acknowledge each other and sort of agree not to speak about each other's kind of shared history in public. And then, as often happens with O'Brien, they have a meal, and over a meal you start to learn a little bit more about these two men and what they care about and what their past history with Irishness and with kind of nationalism means to them.
And it's
page turn.
One of the things that I love there too is it looks to me, I mean, I remember my initial impression, and even coming back to it now, like, oh my goodness, there are now 3 protagonists here, and they're all playing a part, and they're all very interesting, and they have very different and unusual relationships to each other that all play out, really well. So I remember seeing one review that said, well, I didn't enjoy Patrick O'Brien as much because there wasn't much in the way of character development. And I went, oh my gosh, I wonder what this person read. So some people say O'Brien is a lot like Jane Austen because, he has this incredible depth and detail and the way he really gets the period right. And other people say, yeah, but he brings every bit of Dickens here, the way he develops so many characters, minor and major,
Absolutely.
so well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably fair to say that the character development can kind of come quite slowly, and it's quite subtle. People don't get a great big challenge and then a great big payoff with, unvarnished kind of hubris every chapter. And there's always a little bit of give and take for the characters. But no, I think there's a loads of development going on. There are very, very long kind of complex arcs. And interestingly, we're going to have the arc of James Dillon as this kind of conflicted but very kind of duty-bound and kind of honor-bound guy serving in a navy that requires him kind of to swear away some of his allegiance to Ireland. It certainly requires him to swear away any public allegiance he might have to his Catholic faith.
Right.
And this starts to come up. We bump up against it over and over again. First of all, we hear kind of Jack Aubrey in his kind of hail fellow, well met, jolly way manages to plant his foot in it and says, I tried to say a few kind of casual things about the Pope, but it turned out that they didn't seem to answer.
Right.
James Dillon doesn't get jokes about the Pope.
Right.
And then later on, when Stephen and Dillon are sitting at dinner, and kind of Stephen maps out this way for them not to be acquainted. I love this line. He says, "I'm often mistaken for my cousin," with a sly castle informer look on his face. And the character of an informer, he says, is more despised in our country than any other.
Yeah.
Which is really kind of deep. You and I, we both share this kind of, contempt for people who kind of inform and turn turncoat on each other. And then, of course, Dillon makes another piece of classic O'Brien dialogue in reply. He says, "I am entirely of your way of thinking."
Yeah, the language is so beautiful. I mean, it's just so wonderful.
Really,
and the depth of some of this. I mean, later I remember Jack is talking to Stephen about this conversation that he's had with Dillon and, about papists. And it's clear Jack is while an incredibly brilliant naval person, is so simple in some other views of the world. But yeah, as in much of O'Brien, this stuff is never black and white. Life is not black and white. There's a lot of grays. And Steve is bringing him up on this whole group, the United Irishmen, that he and Dillon had both been a part of, and brings Jack attention up to say, no, it's actually led by Protestants who are trying to knit together Protestants and Catholics and Presbyterians and others and Irish rule. And you think, wow. So one of the things that I love about this is, again, I can read this with a Kindle and be going to Wikipedia and definitions all the time to get more and more and more, or I can read it right through and pick it up and realize O'Brien is leaving breadcrumbs, which he will snatch back together and will be meaningful. And there are other parts that you can enjoy as the depth, as deep a depth of history as you want, or you can continue to flow with the story and you're fine both ways. You get a huge payoff both ways.
Absolutely, it's just so rewarding to kind of keep paying attention and kind of keep digging behind what's going on in the narrative and in the dialogue. I just want to skip ahead to some more of the conversations between James and Stephen, because I think
Oh, please.
how they kind of how they dig through, what are they going to make of this shared history that they have? What are they going to make of the situation that they find themselves in a ship of war, commanded by and for the betterment of the state of Great Britain, which neither of them can claim primary allegiance to, but they're both feeling hidebound. I think Stephen hidebound by wanting to do a good job as a surgeon and as a philosopher, and also beginning to feel kind of connected to his friendship with Jack. James hidebound to the very abstract idea, I think, of honor and duty. He's not in it for the king. He's in it because he thinks it's right to defeat kind of characters like Bonaparte, and he's taken this on, so he should do it, with his full commitment. And we get this conversation about patriotism between James Dillon and Stephen. And these are two Irishmen in private, in their quietest, most kind of candid moments. And this is the kind of writing that I think, with great respect to Forrester, blows Hornblower a mile out of the water. There's this real kind of tension and darkness in what these two men are kind of thinking about and wrestling with. There's a really great speech from Stephen Maturin on patriotism, and I'm going to read some of it out. He says, "I have had such a sickening of men in masses and of causes that I would not cross this room to reform Parliament or prevent the Union or to bring about the millennium. I speak only for myself, mind, it's my own truth, but man as part of a movement or a crowd is indifferent to me. He is inhuman. I have nothing to do with nations or nationalism. The only feelings I have," this is Stephen speaking, remember, "the only feelings I have for what they're worth are for men as individuals. My loyalties are to private persons." "Patriotism will not do?" asks James. "My dear creature," classic Stephen phrase, "my dear creature, I have done with all debate. You know as well as I do that patriotism is a word, and one that generally comes to mean either my country right or wrong, which is infamous, or my country is always right, which is imbecile." And great quote, really great speech, deep into the philosophy of where a liberal person's perspective, if you like, on, where do you sit in a state and when the state's at war, written again from the perspective of somebody writing in the 1960s, able to think through what would it have been like for these guys, because the troubles were flaring up in Ireland again in the late 60s, as lots of us know.
Yeah, I think it's just brilliant writing and incredible depth, as well as very much you're talking about defining the characters, being absolutely true to where they are, and not just some speech pulled in the middle, but it's who Stephen is and will be and continues to be. It's where this life in this book to me is even richer than life sometimes.
Right.
Now,
excellent. Well, we've gone deep into the characters. Maybe we should talk a little bit about naval life as well. So, what were you going to say, Mike?
Well, I was going to say, because I know we're kind of moving ahead in the chapters here, but I wondered, and you tell me if it's right to bring it up here or not. There's that great conversation that this is between Jack and Stephen, perhaps a little bit earlier than this, about the goat. And I'm not sure whether whether we can do that justice here, but and the reason I bring it up is this, that, and again, I'm sensitive to looking at these reviews and different people. And the other thing, in addition to people who are concerned about this nautical terminology that I found, is that there's an occasional person who basically is condemning or condemns these books to say the characters aren't woke enough for them, or that Patrick O'Brian wasn't woke enough for them, that, the treatment of women, of, racial minorities, of even, one of the reviews I read talked about homosexuality here. And I thought, wait a minute, we're talking about the 1960s, taking a very detailed and accurate view of the 1800s. And even doing so, to me, there's a lot of this that's terribly woke. Both, we just saw that in Stephen's comment about patriotism, and even in this little incident of the goat, where I went, wow, this is a little unheard of. back then for sure, I
Yeah.
would think. Certainly unheard of for the 60s, and perhaps for some people now. And in a typical O'Brien fashion, he does it in a way that not only makes a great point, but is funny as can be. And
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
it's so easy to miss stuff like that, and so easy when you don't miss it to say, "Oh my gosh, where else can I find this? I love this."
Now, we maybe we've run a little bit far ahead with all this character drama stuff and making it sound too much like a character study. And we've got to remember that people are maybe picking this book up, looking for naval action and navalisms. And by this point that we've got to here, a couple of chapters in, of course, the Sophie is sent out on a cruise. It's sent out, first of all, escorting a convoy, and then it gets the chance to chase down pirates. And there is action there, and we see the crew learning to kind of ply their cannon and learn how to kind of work together as a team to fire a broadside. The first bit of action is undercut. Like Patrick O'Brien often loves to undercut action scenes because it all takes place while the crew are busy occupied with something else. And it's Stephen Maturin, the landlubber, who spots that an Algerine pirate is making off with one of the kind of boats in the convoy. So we have this kind of quick scrap getting this Norwegian vessel back, and nearly a brush with prize money, and we learn a little bit about how excited the crew are at the idea of prize money. But I think there's a bigger theme here, which is the idea of the Navy in general, and Jack in particular, kind of really always feeling this need to be ready. And that kind of links us into some of the kind of the key words and ideas that Jack keeps coming back to, right?
Well, it's so true. I talked earlier today about, shall suffer death as one of these things
Yeah.
that stayed in my mind for years and years and years. Lose not a moment is the other one. This idea that, whether it's lose not a moment or there's not a moment there's not a moment to be lost. It comes up again and again and again. And it's one that Stephen says, what is with all this rushing about? What are you doing here? And Jack explains it to him. So let me quote Jack here. Jack says, "It's as
Yeah.
much a part of our life as salt pork, even more so in tide flow waters. Anything can happen in 5 minutes' time at sea. Ha ha! You could even hear Lord Nelson on this. In this case of gunnery, a single broadside can bring down a mast and so win a fight. And there's no telling from 1 hour to the next when we may have to fire it. There is no telling at sea." So,
Great quote. Yeah.
yeah, we've got this Jack's perpetual hurry. And occasionally, when Stephen needs to get Jack's attention and move him quickly, he shall say, "Jack, there's not a moment to be lost." So that people want to get there. They have this fear of missing out. I'm jumping ahead here,
FOMO.
but yeah, exactly. FOMO, which seems to have survived even COVID-19, as I read people's writings online as we're sitting here doing this podcast nowadays. But the this fear of missing out later, and I don't mean to jump ahead in books here, but later you find a little bit of modesty with Jack, and you
Yeah.
might think of it as false modesty, but he very much says it's about being at the right place at the right time. And some people get those opportunities and some people don't. And it's fascinating how as you introduce different characters throughout the story, some people come in and say, and through no fault of their own, they never had gotten to have a really active dust up with the enemy or something like that.
So I want to just kind of interrupt the flow for a minute, and I want to pick up on an aspect of the book that might well have been important for loads of us getting into these novels in the first place, and that's the
Mm.
fact that there's a connection between the novel and the movie. The Peter Weir movie, I can't remember the year of production. Um, the Russell Crowe, Paul Bettany, Master and Commander brackets Far Side of the World movie. I know that I didn't see it until I think I'd read most or all of the series. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, same way. I'd read the series and then went back to see the movie, and I remember scratching my head a little bit, going, "Which book is this?" You know,
Right. I mean, it's a good movie, and I really enjoyed it, and the characterization is
yes,
great, and the authenticity is fantastic. But in terms of wanting to follow along the stories in the books, it's a real mishmash, a cleverly put together mishmash, but it's a mishmash. So I thought maybe as we do more of these podcasts, we can have a feature, a Russell Crowe alert or something where we say, here's a bit from the movie, because they're scattered all the way through the books.
It's a
So,
great idea.
so I tell me what you think. I think we've got 3 in Master and Commander the novel. So first of all, one of the early dinners in the gun room, we have a speech where Jack Aubrey talks about Nelson. Nelson, his kind of hero and role model. Remember, this is 1800, so it's before the Battle of Trafalgar, but Nelson was already a big deal. He was already an admiral, and he already had a really illustrious kind of fighting record. And we get this speech recounted by Jack as he's kind of describing his interactions and conversations with the great Nelson. Jack's describing this encounter with Horatio Nelson and says, Nelson was telling us how someone had offered him a boat cloak on a cold night, and he, Nelson, said, no, he was quite warm. His zeal for king and country left him warm. It sounds absurd as I tell it, does it not? And was it another man, any other man, you would cry out, oh, what pitiful stuff, and dismiss it as mere enthusiasm. But with him, you felt your bosom glow. Now, this is a rare bit of kind of poetic, sincere speech from Aubrey with no undercuts or asides or kind of, Aubreyisms. This is kind of a real sincere admiration for Nelson, and it's great to kind of help us get an idea of who Aubrey was following. And obviously it's used in the movie for the same purpose, right? In a slightly different context. I think in the movie it's HMS Surprise in mid-Atlantic, where here is HM Brig Sophie in mid-Mediterranean. But We're talking about enthusiasms. And of course the other members of the ship's company have their enthusiasms as well. James Dillon and his kind of suppressed enthusiasm for Irish freedom, and Stephen Maturin and his enthusiasms for philosophy and for other parts of his backstory.
And maybe Catalan independence. I don't know.
Catalan independence as well. Yeah, right. I missed that. So, Mike, we've been talking for a while now. I think this might be almost our podcast episode 1 done. We've made great progress, but we're not quite there, right? We're halfway through the book?
Yeah, and it's interesting because so much has happened, and at the same time, as in Patrick O'Brien's style, so much is yet to happen. You're never quite done, even when you think you are.
You're really not. How is Stephen Maturin going to get on learning to find his feet in the ship's company? How are the ship's company going to resolve their animosities and tensions between them? How's James Dillon going to get on resolving his own internal tension between his role as a lieutenant and his kind of passion for Irish independence? How is Jack Aubrey's military life, his love life, and his social life? How are they going to be taken forward? What are we going to find out next? So, this has been the first of what we hope will be many Lubber's Hole podcasts to come. We're going to get right on and bring you the second half of this novel and bring you episode 2 to finish off Master and Commander. We want to say thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed sharing this time with us, please subscribe. Please tell your friends. What else can they do, Mike?
Well, they could find us if they have some constructive feedback or suggestions for what they'd like to hear more of in future podcasts. Find us via our Facebook page.
That's right, facebook.com/Lubber's Hole. So, please join us again. Please tell us what you like. We've got loads of ideas for more podcast episodes to come. Mike, what do you say to a little more Patrick O'Brian?
With all my heart. Perhaps without milk, then, if you please.